Good afternoon. Hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for joining us today. We are pleased to present this webinar on US artist visas and international travel in the age of COVID. My name is Krista Bradley, and I'm the Director of Programs and Resources at APAP. I am joined today by my fellow co-presenters who are visible now on screen and named in the current slide. We're all so glad to be working together on this presentation, and we'll now be turning our cameras off with the exception of ASL interpreters so that your screen is filled with the content slides until later in the presentation. I would like to acknowledge that today we are meeting from several locations, but are gathered on the Zoom platform. Zoom is headquartered in San Jose and on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Ramaytush and Muwekma Ohlone people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I'd like to pay my respect to the Ramaytush and Muwekma Ohlone elders, both past and present. Before we get started today, I wanted to share a few quick ways you can interact with each other and also with our speakers. On your screen, you should see chat and Q&A functionality tabs. Chat allows you to say hello to others attending the webinar and make general comments throughout the session. The Q&A functionality is for the sole purpose of asking our speakers questions that you would like them to address or to raise a technical issue you might have. Any questions put in the Q&A section will only be seen by our speakers. This session will be closed captioned and also ASL interpreted. During today's presentation, the image of the interpreter will appear side by side with the slide deck. You can adjust the size of the interpreter box by sliding to the left or right the vertical line that divides the interpreter's video from single slide images. The closed captioning will appear automatically on your screen. If you would like to disable the chat transcript, please click More on the bottom of the Zoom window and hide subtitle. Actually, I want to make a correction. To turn on captions, please click the closed caption icon on the bottom of your Zoom window and show subtitle. My apologies. Also, a reminder that the slide deck and recording of this presentation will be made available after today's webinar. We are grateful for the many questions that were shared in advance of the presentation. While we will be monitoring any additional questions submitted during the course of the presentation, we may not get to everything and respond to them all. Please rest assured that all questions will continue to inform the guidance available on Artists from Abroad and in future learning events. So now we just want to go over what we will be covering today, and I'll just want to walk you through what to expect. We'll have a brief introduction to highlight the goals and points that we'll cover today. We'll review the Artists from Abroad website and the visa process. We'll go over COVID-19 travel restrictions, and we'll review policy considerations and next steps. I am very happy to acknowledge our wonderful partners for today, in addition to those we've already described early on. They include all of these organizations on your screen. I don't need to read them, but we are incredibly grateful for their partnership and the work that we collectively do together to make this work happen and to work on behalf of our respective members. And now I think I am turning this over to my wonderful colleague Heather Noonan from the League. Heather?
Great, thank you so much, Krista. And just to echo your thanks, also wanted to share ours from the League of American Orchestras. So all of the national organizations that have partnered to present this webinar. These groups also work collectively year-round to support international artist mobility in really two key ways. One is to try to provide consistent information to those that are using this visa process to help enhance opportunities to navigate what is a very complex and always changing system. And then the other is to work collectively to try to influence policies, to always aim to make that system more streamlined, affordable, accessible, and ultimately equitable. So for today, our goals through this webinar are fundamentally to help support ongoing global opportunities for international cultural activity by giving you the up-to-the-minute information on how the U.S. artist visa process is working, where the challenges are, and where the opportunities are. So as we move through this conversation, we're going to be relying on resources that you may already be familiar with. Some are static, including the Artists from Abroad website, other guidance that you might see through newsletters and information's communicated field-wide, and also on experts who are deep into the visa processing system day by day. We're going to overview some of the basic requirements. We know some come to this conversation with a lot of experience in navigating O&P artist visas, and then for others, this is really the first time stepping into that. But as we go through the conversation, we want to acknowledge really from the beginning that the O&P visa requirements, the legacy of the 2017 travel ban that was repealed in 2021, but still has a long tail to it, and the lack of transparency and predictability in how the US visa process works from country to country has really created barriers to equitable access for cultural activities here in the US. And on top of that, the more recent COVID-19 related travel restrictions have presented still further inequitable barriers to artist mobility. So we want to be sure that as we move through this, we seek the opportunities to make this process more equitable, both through our daily practice and also through policy improvements further to come. So near the end of this presentation, we're going to move from discussing the how-tos of the artist visa process to how we could all work together to improve these policies in the long run. So for the next few moments, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Nejin Lee, also in the League of American Orchestras, Washington, DC office. If you've engaged with the Artists from Abroad website, Nejin is really the person behind all of those pages who keeps the information up to date and also creates news updates on a regular basis. And so with that, I'll now hand it over to Nejin.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. So I'm going to spend the next few moments going through the overview of the artist visa process. For those of you who have a lot of familiarity, just please bear with us for a few moments, but we know that we have a pretty wide universe of people signed up for today's webinar. So for those of you who are maybe a little bit less familiar, we wanted to point out that this is a somewhat complicated process, and it does actually involve interfacing with 3 different US agencies. And the first 2 are probably going to be the most familiar to you, but the third that does come into play as that final step is Customs and Border Protection. For the most part, though, you will hear us referring to USCIS, which stands for US Citizenship and Immigration Services, and then the US Department of State for the consular processing. So you might see us refer to that as DOS or state. USCIS is typically the kind of longest and first part of this process. It's where traditionally the most unpredictability has been, because this is the stage when a US-based petitioner has to seek approval for a visa for an international guest artist, or that is the universe of beneficiaries that we are discussing today. And it is important to note that the person filing an O or P visa, which I will get to in a moment, does have to be a party based in the US. So what that person will get, if everything goes well, and it can take a matter of weeks to months, is an approval notice at the end of that process. And in most cases, that approval notice will then be given to the artist or artists, if you're engaging a group of them, and they would then make an appointment for what we call consular processing. And this will take place outside of the US, and it involves an interview and eventually, again, if all goes well, the issuance of the physical visa that will go in the passport. And then when the time comes for those artists to enter the US, that is when they would interface with Customs and Border Protection. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, the main classifications that we're discussing are O's and P's. So just to get a little bit specific for a moment, the O1B, this is usually going to be the classification you're dealing with when you're engaging a soloist or perhaps a lead actor. You might hear me just sort of by default of my organization association refer to orchestral examples. So an O1B would be someone who's going to be in an individual role, right? So it's not going to be someone performing as part of a group, but again, in sort of the orchestral example, a solo violinist, perhaps a cellist, or maybe even a music director. The O2 would be any personnel that are accompanying that primary beneficiary. Then we have the P category, and there are a few that you can see here. And for those of you, well, actually everyone will get a copy of these slides, and you'll see that these hyperlinks will take you to more information. So the P1B is usually used for ensembles, and those can be as small as duos to as large as an entire opera company, dance troupe, an international orchestra. There is sort of one interesting example, though, which is an exception to the P1B, which is that it can also be used for an individual performing as part of a US-based organization. So again, one example of that would be perhaps a section musician in an orchestra, or a dancer as part of an entire troupe. It would not be for someone soloing. Again, that would be the O1B, but someone who's performing as part of the US-based ensemble or US-based group, there is the ability to use a P1B. That can be really useful if the individual in question may not have as many credentials or coverage from, winning competitions or contests, and it can be a little harder to prove the O1B standard has been met. In such a case, the P1B is useful for a US-based organization that has a prominent reputation of its own that it can then rely upon. So artists from abroad will go into more details for that, but we wanted to just mention. P2 is for reciprocal exchange programs. These typically are not in as much use, except for with a couple of limited examples. So the American Federation of Musicians is one, Actors Equity is another. Again, just please feel welcome to click on this link when you get the slides later, and you can find more information about that. But there are limited examples under which the P2 is available. P3 is for individuals or for groups that are culturally unique. And that is not to speak to the uniqueness of their citizenship, but the uniqueness of the artistry. And that does need to be demonstrated. And then just as there is a category of support personnel for the O1B, there is a P support category for P1s and P3s. So you have heard us mention the Artists from Abroad website. This is a website that we try to keep as up to date with information as possible. That said, if you ever see an error, please feel free to shoot a message through the contact us link that you see in the top of the page. This is just a screen grab of the website. But if you go to www.artistsfromabroad.org, this is what you'll see. And it's really split currently into two major sections, the immigration procedures and tax requirements. We will not be going into the tax requirements today. Immigration procedures is quite enough to be dealing with. But once you go through the entire process, do take a look at the tax requirements side at your leisure, because there are important things to know about withholding. But in order to navigate any of this information, you would just click over immigration procedures, and then you'll see a whole host of information, and it's designed to be pretty self-explanatory and be a way to help anyone walk themselves through the process. Although many people will call upon the advice of attorneys, this is really also a way that if you give yourself enough time, you can actually navigate this process on your own. Of course, it will depend on how complex the case is, how much time you have, and whether you're looking to engage someone who's going to be performing with a bunch of different other organizations. So this is on its face something that you can figure out, and Artists from Abroad is our hope to make that process a little bit easier to understand. I'll just point out a couple of other sort of main links through that resource. It is, really where we point everyone first. So this is kind of your one-stop shop. When you do click on the immigration link, when you saw those first in the previous slide, if you choose the immigration section, the immigration procedures appendix is really, really useful. And I actually will have that on the next slide to just sort of in brief show you what that looks like. That truly actually is your one-stop shop for the links that you could get for cover letter templates, links to forms, special memos that can be helpful and so on. You will also find on Artists from Abroad links to filing fees. Those do change from time to time. There's step-by-step guidance for how to complete the Form I-129. That's the form that you would use whether you're applying for any of the O or P categories we talked about, as well as for other ones as well. But the step-by-step guidance does walk you through how you would fill out the I-129 if you're engaging an O1B versus a different classification. And then finally, the news updates is also very handy, and I'll show you a screen grab of that as well. And that's where we're really keeping everyone up to date with what we know and what we think everyone else needs to know. So this is that appendix that I had just referenced, and it's a much longer page than this, but this just gives you an idea of the kinds of resources that you'll find. These are all hyperlinks that will take you either to USCIS links or other pages, and we also have several PDFs uploaded through Artists from Abroad. And again, just like if you see any errors in the website as a whole, sometimes we've been really thankful to users of the site who have let us know when there's been a change in consultation fees, for example. So just let us know, and we try to get those updates fixed as quickly as possible. This is that news page that I had mentioned as well, and you'll find that on the home page, there's always going to be the sort of top news. And then if you click on any of those, there will always be a link to all news items. And all news items, which is what you see in the body of this page here, will scroll down much further if you're looking at the live page. And I will actually just show you, this is the current and very latest news item right now. And what we are hoping is that this is something that we can keep posted. And so rather than having to bookmark several links, when it comes to COVID-19 visa and travel status updates, we're going to look to really keep this particular page up to date. So as we learn new information, feel free to just refresh this. This page is going to be hyperlinked in the slides, but also if you go to Artists from Abroad, you'll see that this is the top news item. And so you can see at the top, it says as of 8/12/21. That will change as we have new information to add. And so any of the news that we have, as well as the Artists from Abroad guidance throughout the website on both the immigration and the tax withholding information, is informed by legal practitioners from Tamizdat, GG Arts Law, and Blue Skies Immigration. And we're really grateful to have just trusted colleagues from all of those organizations who are really helpful in kind of giving us a sense of what's happening on the ground, what kind of practical advice we can let people know about, and to just double check the information before we post it when there are sort of major changes to flag for people. And speaking of Tamizdat, I will actually now hand it over to our friend Matthew Covey, who is going to walk us through some of the main things that we know are bringing you here today, which are the impacts of COVID-19.
Thanks
Matthew?
again.
Great.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I on? Okay, good. I'm Matthew Covey. I'm the executive director of Tamizdat and also the founding partner at Covey Law. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape people in Brooklyn. Middle-aged white man. I'm wearing a blue shirt. And I'm speaking to you from my office, which looks office-y, but you can't see that because the cameras are off. But now you know. We run a program called Tamizdat Avail, which is really designed to work as kind of to dovetail with Artists from Abroad. It's a free service where you can reach 24 hours, 7 days a week. You can reach a volunteer immigration attorney who can kind of fill in the gaps if you get yourself into the process of filing your own petition and something goes wrong. There's somebody on hand to try to help you figure out what it is that went wrong. So that's a service that we provide. But what I'm here today to talk about really is where things stand with artist mobility to the US, and what's possible, what's not possible, and what we know and what we don't know. So I'm just going to kind of work through a series of questions that I keep hearing from our clients, and then we will do a case study in a little bit, where we talk about like, okay, so you're a presenter, how do you even begin to think about making decisions in the current context? Let's start by asking the basic question: how do the COVID-19 travel restrictions impact international artists who are traveling to the US, and who is impacted? COVID-19 travel ban prohibits individuals who are physically present in the 33 countries in the last 14 days immediately prior to their travel to the US. On the screen, you can see what those 33 countries are. It's also important to notice that if you do not, that it impacts people who do not have a close family member, like a spouse or a child who is in the US, who is a US citizen, or who's a green card holder, or a member of the US Armed Forces. So what that means is, if you're trying to bring an artist to the US and they're German, then they are probably affected by the travel restrictions, unless they happen to be married to a US citizen or are in the US Armed Forces, which seems unlikely, but that's the way the rules are working. It's important to notice that this is not about travelers' citizenship. It's about where they were physically prior to traveling to the US. And that's important because a lot of people get confused. Like, I'm German, or I'm Norwegian, I can't travel to the US right now. That's not what it's about. It's, where are you? Are you, if you're Norwegian, but you're in Jamaica, well, you don't really have a problem. You can travel to the US. So let's move on to the next question. That would be the next slide, please. How do I get my artist to the US? So my artist is in one of the 33 travel ban countries, but needs to enter the US. How can I get her here? Well, there's two different categories to answering this question. If the artist currently has the appropriate P or O visa that Najen was talking about, they have two options. They can go to a non-ban country and hang out there for 14 days and then proceed on to the US. Lots of people are going through Mexico. A lot of Caribbean countries, people are traveling to those, hanging out there for 2 weeks, and then traveling on to the US. It's important to remember that you have to travel to the US by some route that doesn't go through a banned country. We've seen a couple of situations where, like, an Italian goes to Romania and hangs out in Romania for 2 weeks and then flies to the US, but oh no, they fly through Heathrow, and then those 2 weeks were wasted because they can't come on into the US because they transited through one of the banned countries. The other option for someone who already has a PRO visa is to seek a national interest exception from their local US consulate. We will get into what the national interest exception is about in a little bit. If the artist does not currently have the appropriate PRO visa, things get a lot harder. They will need to petition for the work authorization. That's the filing the I-129. That's what Najen was talking about. Then schedule an interview at their local US consulate, and then apply for the visa and request a national interest exception. This is a lot easier said than done. And we'll go through all the sort of pain that is related to trying to get appointments and trying to get a national interest exception approved down below in a moment. I want to also point out here that that currently US consulates around the world claim that they are not processing visas for third country nationals. So that means if your artist rather is, say, Spanish, and they don't have a visa, they can't go to Mexico, hang out there for a little bit, apply for the visa in Mexico City, get the visa issued, and then proceed to the US. US embassies and consulates are not processing visas for people who are not in residence in those countries. That's the rule. We know that there's been some exceptions to this, but for the most part, if you don't have that PRO visa already, then you're going to be kind of stuck trying to go through the national interest exception process in your own country. Because this process is hard and everybody's hearing about how hard it is, there's a lot of people who are wondering, well, is it possible to do this? Can I get a PRO visa right now? Getting a PRO visa, as Najen has explained, is required for performing in the US in almost all situations. It's currently a 3-stage process: the I-129, which Najen talked about, the visa application, and now, if necessary, the national interest exception. As always, the I-129 is needed to be filed by a US petitioner, proving that the artist is of a caliber deserving of the status and that they have bona fide contracted employment in the US. This part of the process is currently functioning pretty much no worse than it always does. Processing times are about 6 weeks in Vermont. California, we're hearing reports of much longer processing times, but it seems like it's really spotty. Sometimes it's going quickly in California, sometimes it's going slowly. We are anticipating that we may be seeing significant increases in processing times through the fall. The reason for this is if we move toward removing travel restrictions at all, we know that the service centers are pretty short-staffed, and we're going to see a real backlog building. We're all very concerned about how big that backlog is going to be, and how long the regular processing is going to take. Right now, again, in Vermont, we're seeing 4 to 6 weeks, but it's not at all inconceivable that that delay could extend to 3 or maybe 4 months by the new year. Then once the petition is approved, the artist needs to file a DS-160 visa application at their local embassy or consulate and schedule a consular interview. This part of the process, the second part of the process, is not working normally. It's not working normally at all. Almost all US consulates are functioning on a reduced capacity if they're functioning at all. Many consulates are not scheduling normal interviews any earlier than spring 2022. If you need a visa sooner than that, you'll need to schedule the earliest possible interview and then contact the consulate and request that they approve you for an emergency interview sooner than that. To convince them that you need an interview sooner than the earliest available normal interview, you will need to convince them that the reason you need to travel to the US is very important. If you're coming from one of the 33 countries from which travel is banned, you'll need to convince them that you are eligible for the national interest exception. Well, again, I'll get onto that in a bit below. Note, it's also important to note that the Department of State, has announced that visa applicants who are applying for a visa in a classification that they've previously received in the last 4 years may be eligible to skip the visa interview process and apply for visas by post. This works in most non-travel ban countries, and in some travel ban countries. It's a really big question right now. For example, we had been told that London is not accepting mail-in applications, but just today we heard that apparently they're saying that they are, although there's some indication that maybe that's just a rumor. We don't really know. It's always worth exploring if you are in that situation where you have had the visa before and you're just trying to get the visa again, you may be able to avoid this whole getting an appointment problem by mailing in your visa. That information about that would be available on the embassy or consulate's own website. Then there's the new part of all of this. This is the thing that nobody's used to because it's been created in the wake of COVID. If you're coming from one of the 33 countries from which travel is banned, you'll need to convince the consulate that you are eligible for a national interest exception. So moving on here, how does an artist get a national interest exception and how does it work? This process is super uncertain. It varies enormously from one consulate to another. The processing times at different embassies and consulates varies dramatically. And each consulate or embassy seems to have different procedures, which they're constantly changing. Normally, you can find fairly reliable information by digging around on the consulate website. The best way to find that information is you just Google national interest exception and the name of the country, and that usually brings you to the right place on the US Embassy website. The main thing, if you're in a situation where your artist or you're trying to help your artist apply for a national interest exception, the main thing you need to provide to the consulate to support your NIE, national interest exception request, is documentation, probably in the form of letters from US entities, meaning the venues, the promoters, the booking agency, et cetera, who stand to lose money if the artist is unable to enter the US. Specifically, that the artist would be coming to provide vital support for economic activity in the US. So what we're trying to prove when you request a national interest exception, you're trying to show how economically devastating them not getting a visa is going to be for US interests. So what's interesting about this is there's no humanitarian consideration, there's no personal consideration, there's no particular cultural consideration. This is an economic issue. So you need to think as broadly as you can about where are all the ways that the US economy is going to lose out if this tour or this performance doesn't happen, and do the best you can to document that and put that together in your request. So that's really the key to it. And what we are seeing is there is no specific number of, like, if the US economy is losing $1,000, you get a national interest exception, or if it's losing $1 million, you get a national interest exception. There is no fixed number, but what we are seeing is that the more you document the information that the claim that you're making, the more likely it is that the embassies will approve this. Again, different embassies are handling this incredibly differently. Right now, Germany, the US consulate in Berlin, the US consulate in London, are both handling this pretty openly. If you're applying for a national interest exception and you've got a contract to perform in the US and it's not, it's a performance of some degree of magnitude, you'll probably get the national interest exception this week. Next week, I have no idea. Whereas there's other consulates which are being much more skeptical. We were just looking at reports today that Madrid is apparently being very strict about who gets national interest exceptions. But this information is constantly changing about what embassies are handling the national interest exception in what way. National interest exceptions are now valid for 12 months if the national interest exception is issued by a US consulate and embassy. That's important to know, because it's also they can be multiple entry if the reason for coming to the US is the same as the reason you got before. So in other words, if you're able to bring your artist, if you're able to go through this national interest exception process now and get your artist approved to come on their O1 visa to the US to do their performances, if you've got another tour in 3 months, they don't have to go through the process again. That national interest exception will stick. It will remain valid for up to a year. And that's important because it means it kind of makes going through the process worth it if you know that you're going to get more mileage out of it. There are rumors that national interest exceptions are being processed by passport control at airports upon arrival in the US. This has happened in certain occasions. It is nothing that you should be counting on at all. It's very, very rare that it's happened. It tended to happen more often early on in the pandemic, early on after the national interest exceptions were first created. Most of the airports have really clamped down on this, and it's something that is very unlikely to work at this point. So do not just try to put an artist on a plane and hope that they get a national interest exception when they arrive. They probably will not get on the plane, but if they do, they'll probably get turned away when they arrive if you haven't gone through the national interest exception process. I'm going to jump from the national interest exception to kind of a broader question. What else do we need to know about the US visa process right now, especially factors that impact artists who are not subject to the COVID-19 travel restrictions? Well, first of all, I want to point out that this is probably the first time in modern history that it's been easier to get an artist from the global south into the US than an artist from Europe. I think we should take this as the universe giving American presenters a hint about who they ought to be programming right now. It's going to be easier to get somebody from Africa or Latin America, probably, or Asia than it is from Europe. That's never happened before. So run with it. We know that there's serious staff shortages at consulates due to the COVID evacuations and the fact that that most of the embassies and consulates around the world have not restaffed after huge amounts of their US staff went home at the beginning of the COVID. So the Foreign Service is in the process of trying to restaff embassies, but it's definitely not done and the training is not complete. We anticipate that new staff is being placed and trained now, but it'll be some months before consulates are back up to normal capacity. And by some months, I wouldn't be surprised if it takes a year to get back up to normal capacity. Also keep in mind that what staff is available is largely occupied right now managing the Afghan crisis. Since these are often life and death circumstances, it's hard to argue with that priority, but just realize that it's really hard to get a favor out of the State Department right now because they've got bigger things to worry about, unfortunately, than our tours. Also, this kind of speaks back to my first point about booking artists from the global south. We had a lovely 18 months when we did not have to deal with the prior administration's extreme vetting procedure. That's the DS 5535 form, which was causing a lot of disturbance in 2019. I was kind of hoping it would just sort of vanish, but it didn't. It's back now. And as we start to bring artists in from a lot of different parts of the world, we're now starting to see that embassies are again applying this extreme vetting procedure. So as with all things, try to leave as much extra time as you possibly can, even if you have artists coming from countries that don't have a travel ban on them. Lastly, because there are so many restrictions, the restrictions are changing so often, and there's so much, so little transparency about how the system is working. Airlines are freaked out because they get fined anytime they allow someone to board a plane to the US who ultimately is not allowed in for whatever reason it might be. So we're seeing a lot of problems where airlines are not allowing individuals to board, even though they are fully, their travel is fully legitimate and allowed. But for some reason, airline gets spooked because, okay, were you in this non-banned country for 14 days or 15 days? I'm not really sure, so we're not going to let you on the plane. So again, like everything else, leave a little extra time so that you're not flying your artist to that performance and having them arrive just in time for sound check. Because if you can leave an extra day or two to make sure that they get on the plane and their plane gets here, that's probably going to be wise. I want to shift now to, are we going to go to the participants' questions now?
Matthew, if this is your time to do the case study, you can.
This is the case study. Okay, I just
Great.
saw that the slide went up for the questions, and I didn't know if that was all right.
Sure, just cue when you're ready for that section.
Okay, I'll do that. So I want to do a case study, and to talk about like how do you I'm sure that from what I was just saying, it just sounds like, wow, that's just so much stuff going on. This sounds terrifying. Why would I ever willfully get myself involved in this? How do I even think about whether it's feasible to book an international artist in the foreseeable future? So I want to talk about that and try to run through a case example. But first of all, in a related plug, I want to mention that presenting right now is all about framing and managing risk. And this is especially the case with contracting international artists. In these really uncertain times, it is important that the risk be shared and its burden not fall disproportionately on those least positioned to sustain that loss. So I want to encourage presenters to follow the lead of Creating New Futures, Dance USA, APAP, and other organizations involved with rethinking how contracts can ensure equity. For more information about the amazing work being done to rethink how we contract, I'm going to put in the chat some links to some of this critical work. It really is the future of how we will be contracting, and a lot of work is being done on this right now. So putting this in the chat to everyone. There it goes. That's 3 different links. They all kind of got jumbled together, but you can figure out how to. Those are all really, really useful resources to think about how to manage these risks when it comes to contracting. Okay, so how would one go about framing and managing these risks and all these unknowns? I'm going to do an analysis now, which is kind of the analysis that we do with a client. But first, I want to point out that there's 3 big unknowns. The first question that we don't know the answer to: will USCIS processing time for regular processing petitions increase from the currently roughly like month to 6 weeks to much longer delays? As I said, given staffing issues at USCIS, there is some. This is something that we are anticipating happen as soon as borders open back up again with the Schengen nations. The second big unknown is, will the COVID national interest exception requirements be lifted in time for the dates that you're anticipating? Right now, Different US consulates are processing national interest exceptions with radically different timeframes. Some are taking as long as 6 weeks, while others are turning around decisions in a couple of days. To accurately predict the overall time it will take to get an artist into the US, it's critical to know how the time frame under which your artist's local US consulate is working. We had hoped that this problem would go away by the end of the summer, but with the Delta variant numbers rising here and in Europe, it's really all bets are off. There's an enormous amount of pressure on the US government right now to remove the COVID restrictions, but I don't think anybody really knows when they might end. The third big unknown right now is, will artists be able to get interviews at US consulates? Even if the national interest exception is removed, embassies are currently working at low capacity, and it's very difficult to schedule visa interviews. The consular delays may not disappear even if the national interest exception is removed. In fact, it could get worse because more people will be eligible for visas. And right now, as I said, the Afghan refugees cases are rightfully forcing pretty much every other topic onto the back burner for all Department of State and USCIS staff. We're already seeing significant delays that we hadn't seen, just before the Afghan crisis started. So this is how this is kind of the way that we would step through an analysis for a client. Let's work backwards from a January 8th entry date for a UK artist. So let's say you're trying to bring an artist to the US to do a performance sometime in mid-January. You want them to enter the US on January 8th. And I'm going to take a UK artist simply because we probably know the most about how that time frame works. We don't have slides for the case study. I'm vamping here, so there's no slides. This is just about listening and trying to kind of wrap your head around how I'm thinking about it. So working backwards from the January 8th entry date, the first thing we know is that currently the London consulate is taking roughly 2 weeks to process a national interest request following the interview. So the interview needs to happen no later than December 25th, but that's Saturday, and the day before is Christmas Eve. So let's say the interview has to happen no later than December 23rd. Okay, so that's the first we're working backwards from our deadline. We know that we have to do the interview no later than December 23rd. Well, currently the soonest normal interview appointment time in London is spring of 2022. So assuming that delay doesn't improve, the artist will need to book that spring 22 appointment and then ask the consulate to grant her an earlier appointment, which is not likely to be for somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. So she needs to be scheduling that appointment no later than October 28th. Okay. In order to complete the interview and to complete the interview, the artist needs to have an approved petition. But to schedule an interview, the artist must at least have the receipt number for that petition. So they can't schedule the appointment until they have the receipt number. So that means you have to get the petition filed to get the receipt number so you can schedule the interview. So you can start the process of scheduling the interview, which is going to take another 6 weeks in order to do the interview by December 23rd, in order to have the passport back, in order to travel on the 8th. I hope it makes sense. This is pretty complex, but I hope it makes sense how we're working backwards from our deadline. So if you're willing to pay the government's $2,500 premium processing fee, you could file the petition a week before the artist needs to schedule the interview, in which case the petition needs to be filed no later than October 20th. Okay, so if you're willing to do premium processing, you can wait until October 20th to file the petition, and you can probably still get them here by January 10th, this UK artist, or by January 8th, this UK artist. However, if you want to avoid the premium processing fee, assuming that USCIS is still processing most petitions in 6 weeks, you'll need to have the petition filed no later than September 15th. So premium processing is pretty much a given right now for early in January, but there's still some more. Isn't premium processing up to 3 weeks now? No, that's not true. It's still 15 calendar days. There was some talk about it being shifted to 15 business days, but that did not happen. So premium processing pretty much a given right now for early January, but there's some other variables that we should be considering here. If by mid-October, the national interest exceptions have been removed, you could probably risk filing with regular processing up until mid-October. We won't know in mid-October what the petition processing delays will look like in November, or the consular processing delays will look like in December. But there'd be no harm in initially being optimistic in mid-October. You can't let it go much later than that, however. If in early November, if early November rolls around and it appears that the petition processing delays are increasing, then we would recommend that you upgrade the petition to premium processing at that time to ensure that you have an approved petition in hand by late November. But if early November rolls around and it appears that the petition processing delays are increasing, and or it appears that the consular delays are shortening, we might advise that you hold off on upgrading until early December, because if it looks like the processing is going to be happening, is getting better, and you get to early December, you don't want to waste that extra $2,500 if you didn't need to, and you can still get an approval by mid-December, which means that the rest of your schedule works. Remember, even if the COVID travel restrictions remain in force, if your artist already has a valid visa, and can be in a non-banned country for the 2 weeks prior to their travel to the US, then you're probably going to be fine. So I'm saying that, reminding you, just because we're talking all about the national interest exception and trying to figure out how to get visa interviews. But remember, a lot of artists out there already have visas, and they're still valid. And if they do, then you can hang on to those. Then as long as they can travel through some route other than a restricted country, you're going to be fine. I'm just going to take a quick look to see if there's any. That was really complex, but I hope it made sense, even if the details were opaque. I hope that the idea of working backwards from, well, I need them here on this date, what are the deadlines I need to look at that will get me to having them on the plane in time for the date I'm looking at. That's the way the analysis has to sort of fold backwards in time. So that's the case study. Obviously, the details would change significantly if it was a different consulate. And so like we were using London, but if it happens to be Stockholm, or if it happens to be Rio de Janeiro, all of these are going to change the way that the calculation works, but the method remains the same. So that's the case study. I'd like to hand over now to my colleague, Liz Mahler, to go through some of the questions that we've received from the attendees in advance of this session. Liz?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Matthew. My name is Elizabeth Mahler. I'm legal fellow and counsel at Tamizdat, and I am speaking to you today from the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape people in Manhattan. Moving on to the questions. Heather, did you want to sort of ask those questions so it's a conversation, or do you want me to just go through them? Okay, great.
Sure, Liz, any opportunity to talk with you, anytime. So just to frame it up, because I know there's been a lot of information shared already, and some of it touches on these questions, but we do want our audience to know, first of all, we really appreciate the questions you shared in advance, and we've distilled some of them to some key themes. And also just to remind you that any questions you're sending us now or have sent us previously that aren't answered here really will help inform the guidance we're posting on Artists from Abroad and elsewhere. So we will make sure you can find the answers somewhere. But we've divided these up into 3 sections, and one of them is around the general visa process. And then we'll get back to some questions specific to the NIE and consular processing procedures. I think we've just touched on the question about the time frame for how early to start the visa applications to USCIS to get your classification approved. And the answer is on that part, really as early as you can, as early as you have a firm view of how many and which artists you plan to engage. But we did hear some questions around the premium processing fee. It's been referenced several times here. We know that it's largely unaffordable for most to use on a regular basis. And so the question here is, what alternatives might you have beyond premium processing? And I wonder, Liz, if this might be a space where we could touch on the traditional expedite procedures that were recently reinstated at CIS.
Yes, absolutely. I would say first, in response to that question, it's a great idea to work with and support your arts organizations that are advocating to reduce the premium processing fee or make it unnecessary. We have been doing that with the League of American Orchestras as well. And thanks to their hard work and everyone's hard work who was involved with that, there's now an option called traditional expedite that's available to many of the nonprofit presenters who are bringing artists over. Do you want to expand on that at all, Heather?
Yeah,
the traditional expedite. I think you've had quite a bit of experience with that.
Sure, and I would just say we do have a section on artists from abroad that is specific to the traditional expedite, so you can find all the details there. One thing I'll just say about it is that previously, CIS, when they thought about this option, they really regarded it as a case in which a petitioner, through no fault of their own, needed rapid processing. So the agency might not be very sympathetic if you can't make the case for why you're coming to them with the need for rapid processing beyond the usual processing times. So I would start there. Also, because this option was frozen for a while, we're still finding out exactly how the agency is using it and administering it now that it's back again. So this is another a case where your experience and informing us, your national organizations, of your experience will be really helpful. But in the meantime, check out that traditional expedite section on artists from abroad. So the next question, and I've seen some variations on this a bit in our live questions during this webinar as well, is around if one entertainment company invites artists from 2 different countries under a single petition and for the same event in the US, how does that work right now?
Well, that can work. I mean, you can absolutely put 2 artists or more than 2 artists from different countries on a single petition for the same event in the US. The only complexity that might come up with that is if the artists are coming on P3 visas, which are the culturally unique visas, in which case they would need to show that they are presenting their traditional and culturally unique culture, indigenous culture, and that would be something that would be harder to prove if they're coming from different countries, showing that they share an indigenous culture.
And also one thing we might want to specify too is that it does depend to a degree on the nature of the activity the artists are doing for the duration of their stay in the US. So typically, if more than one artist is on a single petition, they're really bound to the events on that combined work together. If you have an artist that's going to be separating from their colleague and doing independent work, they may need to be on their own visa petition, correct?
Yes. Yes, we're talking about, you know, the event, if they're participating in the same event or events, then they can be on the same petition. But if it's going to be separate, then they might need to separate out into different petitions.
And then the next question is around green card status, which is, we'll point out is green card status and permanent residency is beyond the scope of the Artists from Abroad website. This question asks about transitioning from a student visa to green card status. And you're welcome to touch on that, Liz, but we often do get questions about artists that are transitioning from a student visa to an O1 status or to work-related visa status. So do you want to comment on that general topic?
Right. There's no requirement. I think the question we received asked if it was necessary. It's not a requirement. Artists in particular do often transition to another category, such as an O1, because it allows them time to develop their credentials and build up their eligibility for the green card, which is the EB1 classification.
So I think we'll move on to the next section of questions, which is some clarifying questions around visa classifications. And one of these is a fundamental one that's really important to go over. At what point is the requirement for a US visa, like an OOP, non-immigrant work visa, triggered? And how does that relate to the compensation that's offered to the artist?
Right. We get the question about compensation a lot, in terms of, if I'm not being compensated, do I still need to have an employment visa? And unfortunately, for these purposes, the fact that there is no compensation doesn't do away with the requirement that they have an employment-based visa. If in fact there's other factors in play that require them to have an employment-based visa, exactly which visa classification is appropriate is going to depend on a lot of factors. And there are situations, maybe not this one, maybe not one where there's, a big concert or something, but there are situations where an employment-based visa wouldn't be required. And there's a lot more information on that on Artist Forum Broad, as you, of course, know. And folks are also welcome to contact us at Tamizdat. We have a limited pro bono sort of email channel that we can respond to, and that's avail@tamizdat.org. So we can sometimes, sort of make the distinction and look at the nuances of a particular case to determine whether or not an artist would need an employment OOP-based visa.
Great. And I think to take these questions a little out of order, the final one also touches on this question around the need for a visa and specific to student performers, and whether is the question around compensation related just to compensating the artist or also to the nature of the event, and whether it's a paid or free concert.
Yeah, the paid or free part of it isn't as relevant, but there are a lot of, it's very, very case specific and nuanced. And so that is something where I would advise just contacting Tamizdat's pro bono channel directly. Again, it's avail@tamizdat.org to share sort of all the specific facts.
Then we have 2 questions here and more in our Q&A box live as well that are related to the requirements and the eligibility and the experience required to qualify for an O1 visa. So the question really is, given that you have to demonstrate that an artist meets this requirement, the requirements for an O1 visa, what kind of general advice do you have about the kind of supporting documents, the range of evidence that can be gathered to make the case for an O1, and when it might be advantageous to seek maybe a P3 status or another visa classification that would work outside of the O1 visa?
Right. Right now the O1 can often feel like a pretty high bar, and I may ask Matthew to weigh in on this as well. If there is an opportunity for the artist to apply for a P3 visa, that is, if their art that they want to bring to the US is closely tied to their national or ethnic heritage, which is what USCIS means by a culturally unique P3 visa, then it's a good idea to apply for the P3 because there's not as much documentation required. There's no particular standard of renown, and they just need to show that they perform a traditional and culturally unique art form, and that all their performances will feature them in this traditional and culturally unique art form. As for the documentation required for an O1, it's fairly specific. It's in the regulations. It is quite a bit more. Do you want to address that at all, Matthew?
Sure. It's hard to explain. It's sort of hard to summarize that in this context because
Yeah.
the documentation that is generally assembled to support an O1 is, it tends to be kind of a mountain of different kinds of evidence, but
Right.
there is a system to it. There are 6 types of evidence that they're looking for, and you have to get 3 of the 6. And the way they adjudicate petitions is really, it's kind of there's a checklist, and if you hit the points of, if you hit the 4 elements of evidence type 1 and the 3 elements of evidence type 2, you will be approved. And if you don't, or if there's some ambiguity, then you're going to get a request for evidence or a denial. So I think that, the way a lot of people, when they're doing this the first time, when they're filing a petition the first time, they're just kind of trying to gather everything they've ever done and put it in a box and send it off to Vermont. And that's not the way to get approved. The way to get approved is to really look at the regulations, understand what they're looking for, and present the documentation you have in a way that speaks directly to what the regulations are looking for. And that's, it's not that hard, but it does take some work, and it does kind of take some kind of parsing through those regulations. Again, those regulations are all available on the Artists from Abroad website.
Right. That's actually what I was thinking, was really go to the Artists from Abroad website, and it has a very clear explanation of the different documents and things that you can submit for an O1.
Yeah, so it provides some examples of supporting evidence. Also, we have a sample petition and cover letter in the appendix to Artists from Abroad. And I just say those cover letters can be really important, because when the CIS agent is looking through a stack of evidence and needs to get to the stuff that they really want to see, your cover letter can point them there. So those are some resources for you. The other thing I just mentioned is that when we're all looking for good news in the visa process, one bit of good news is that the new administration has instructed CIS adjudicators to be really cautious about when they go back to a petitioner with a denial or a request for evidence, and that those not be frivolous. So they're under kind of a new instruction. We hope this bears fruit, but they're under new instruction to not be just kind of randomly issuing requests for more evidence or denials, but to really make sure that it's appropriate. So you can help them with that by an artfully crafted cover letter that goes with your petition. I think we'll move on to our final slide of questions that really dig in to these complexities around consular processing and the NIE process. And the first one is again around the consular interview process, interventions that can be done. So you've already said time and again, Matthew, that these timeframes are variable. They vary by consulate. They vary within a consulate over a span of time. That contacting the consulate to find out what the time frame is like is your best bet. But once you get that answer and it's not going to work for your concert date, is there anything that can be done or tried to speed that up? And Liz or Matthew?
Yeah, Matthew, do you want to, I mean, as Matthew sort of addressed before, you need to get your interview on the calendar, even if the first available date is spring 2022. And then you need to be in contact with them and convince them that it is very important and that it's technically an emergency situation, meaning that the venue can contact the consulate and that they're going to lose money, that the show needs to go on. And then you will also, if you're from one of the 33 countries that's subject to the travel ban, need to get a national interest exception. Do you want to talk about anything that's more than that, Matthew?
No, I think that's about it. The procedure for getting an interview, like if you're applying somewhere where there's no interview anywhere in the foreseeable future, Liz is right. You have to schedule whatever's available and then go about, so you're in their books and then go about the process of trying to convince them to get something earlier than that. If that fails, if you put together a proper request for an emergency interview and that request is denied, right now, given the staffing issues and the Afghanistan issues, we have had very little luck getting embassies to reconsider a denial of an emergency interview. You're kind of out of luck at that point. Then, you know, I think you're probably, you know, there are some situations where you can try another consulate, but even that's difficult right now, because if you're in a country that only has one consulate, you're gonna be out of luck there. So I wouldn't advise that. Yeah, the process is really making sure that when you request an emergency interview, that you're preparing the best possible case you can.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that did occur to me as you were speaking, Matthew, is the mail-in option. There are situations where I think, again, this was mentioned in the overview discussion, but if you're applying, if an artist is applying for a visa classification that they already received in the previous 4 years, they may not need to go to the consular office for another interview, and they may be able to apply by post. So that doesn't really go to expediting a consular interview, but it is a way to perhaps not need to go through that step of the process.
That's
again, you have to check with the particular consulate. It's very consulate specific.
so much of this is, right? So much of it goes back to each consulate's practices. There is a question here around spouses. So if an artist does obtain an NIE, is a separate NIE required for the spouse, or does that usually happen simultaneously?
Well, so there's no, so for in the COVID travel restrictions, there's no provision that allows for the spouse to come with. So the spouse would independently need to meet the national interest exception standard, or if they're eligible for ESTA or a B1, B2 visa, they could possibly come in that way. And if they're from one of the 33 countries that's restricted due to COVID, they would need to travel via a non-banned country to get in that way.
Right. So we just want to, I know a number of questions that have come in live during this has been about that 14-day option, the option of going to a non-banned country. And so we just want to encourage people to familiarize yourself with that, because for so many who are saying this NIE process just doesn't seem to work for us, what's my other option? That is the one, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
there are a couple of other follow-up questions, and one of them is a really practical one that we might have touched on this earlier, but if you receive an NIE, it's really not like a visa in the sense that your visa is getting stamped in your passport. How do you know when you have one, and how do you put it to use once you have it?
The NIE is usually sometimes it's being noted in people's passports if it's part of the visa process. Like, in other words, if you're getting a visa and an NIE at the same time, it may be noted in the passport in the foil. Otherwise, a lot of times it's simply an email that you get from the embassy saying, yep, you've been approved, and you're going to want to print that out and travel with it. And you'll, when you get to the airport, you'll show it to the airline officials. They're going to look at that and say, okay, that's great. We're probably going to double check it with some database, with the Customs and Border Protection database, but it's probably just going to be an email that you print out.
And so two more questions related to the NIEs. One is, we've talked about the case that the individual has a strong connection to the economic strength of the organization that they're working with, and that organization has a strong economic impact in its community. In a minute or less, can you advise on some ways to make that case? Are we talking about dollar figures? Are we talking about third-party folks like mayors maybe attesting that the organization has an economic impact? What do you advise might work?
All of that works or helps make the case. Certainly, an affidavit or just a letter from the U.S. entity, the promoter, the venue, explaining, breaking down, like, we've sold 1,000 tickets, all of the, at $50 each, all those tickets will have to be returned. we employ 40 people on the night of a show. All of them will lose work for that night and for the day of prep before. Like basically break it down like this. There's a hotel that the entourage of 15 will be staying at. They're going to be losing $4,000 of hotel bookings for that. Like try to break it down as broadly as you can. What are all the different factors? And obviously the more renowned the person who's writing the letter is, or the entity, if this is coming from Carnegie Hall, it's going to make more difference than some dive bar on the Lower East Side. If it's coming from the mayor, it's going to make more difference if it's coming from somebody who doesn't have the mayor's letterhead.
So the last question is kind of asking, I think, all of us to gaze into the future and imagine if there are any signals that might tell us that this US COVID-19 travel ban will be changed or lifted anytime soon. We know there have been talks across the US and the EU over the summer. A task force was created to have discussions on these topics. But then we saw a lot of variation between what the EU posture was and our continued ban here in the US. So what does this suggest to you about the bigger picture on the travel ban?
That is a risky question to try and answer in front of 261 people, but I'll give it a whirl. I think that we are seeing chatter amongst the lawyer class that there may be a COVID related a vaccination requirement for non-immigrant visas. There's already a vaccination requirement for immigrant visas. There's talk that may be put in place soon. If that happens, then it kind of opens up some of it makes the broader travel ban less necessary if they're starting to put in place ways to make sure that those travelers who are coming are vaccinated. That has just kind of cropped up in the last week. We've been seeing that. So I feel like there is so much pressure on our government to stop this. There's so many industries that are being massively negatively impacted by the travel restrictions that I think they're going to have to come up with some kinds of ways of making this making travel more viable in the next 2 or 3 months.
So I think this is a good point to wrap things up with a few comments about how our community collectively have been trying to influence what happens next in this space. And I'm just going to quickly summarize what the long-term policy efforts are and what the near-term requests are on this. And I think most of you who are listening to this webinar have actually been helping us all to make the case for changes in the U.S. artist visa process that will make this much more efficient, affordable, reliable, accessible, all in support of being able to plan international engagements. And so we continue to be in dialogue with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the new administration, the State Department, about all of the things those agencies can do under the laws they're working with now to streamline the artist visa process. At the same time, we're also working with some leaders in Congress who see opportunities to tweak the O&P visa laws in ways that will kind of seal this effort to make the process turn around faster and work the way it's intended to. Those are long-term efforts in addition to trying to help improve consular processing by and large. At the same time, since the onset of COVID, we have collectively been forming and advancing some very specific policy suggestions, and lots of thanks to the friends at Tamizdat who really got underneath the detail of every regulation so that we could point out to the federal agencies that there are things they can do that will help. The most recent request has been to ask the administration to provide an opportunity for artists to be more clearly eligible for the NIE so that there will be more options for that. As you just heard from Matthew, it's very hard to read signals on when the current policy will change. But as long as we continue to make the case, we've seen some exemptions made for other types of workers. As long as we have a presence in those conversations, we have some hope that we'll be able to get access to the NIEs, at least until the travel ban is lifted. We also have been pointing out to USCIS, and I've seen some questions related to this as well, that so much has been invested in applications in progress before COVID and during COVID, and that we'd hope the agency would provide opportunity to acknowledge those requests without the cost and burden of completely refiling them. We don't yet have a positive or an affirmative answer on that, but it's a request that we continue to move forward. So if you can advance the slide, I think our last point to make is just to summarize that there are things you can do to continue to help. Please do document the difficulties and the timeframes you're experiencing. Keep your elected officials informed of that so that it helps to make the case for policy changes. And also, please keep all of us, our national service organizations, informed of your experience, because what we hear from you really does fuel the policy action that we take next. So with that, and just 2 minutes to spare, and a reminder to keep checking the Artists from Abroad site, I'm going to turn this right back over to Krista for a conclusion.
And thank you, Matthew and Elizabeth and Najin, and thanks to our ASL interpreters as well. Here's a contact slide, so please do be in touch with any of us for more information or to report out how things are going or the experiences that you're having. So you can reach me at kbradley@apap365.org or Najin and Heather at their email addresses that you see here, and Matthew and Elizabeth at their email addresses here. And I think they also put it into the chat. And then if we can go to that last slide, I do want to just thank again our partners on this with the League of American Orchestras, Artists from Abroad, and Tamizdat, and our other amazing partners that helped us promote and supported this and co-hosts: American Association of Independent Music, Chamber of Music America, Dance USA, Folk Alliance International, National Performance Network, North American Performing Arts Managers and Agents, or NAPAMA, Opera America, Performing Arts Managers and Agents Coalition, and Theater Communications Group. Before we depart, a reminder that everyone who registered for today's event will receive an email with the recording and the PowerPoint presented today. You will also receive a request to complete an evaluation of this webinar, and we really appreciate any feedback you can offer. We hope that this was valuable for you, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again for joining us, and have a fantastic rest of your day.